She didn't ask for a bed. She didn't ask for food. She stood at a stranger's gate in the dark and asked to sleep in a pen with his goats. She asked for less than she deserved, because that is what the road had taught her to do. And the man who opened that gate, what he chose to do, is the thing you will sit with long after the story ends. But before we go further, here is what you do not know yet. The man at that gate was about to hear one name from her mouth, one company name. And when he heard it, he would realize that the person who had destroyed this woman's life was closer to him than any enemy should ever be allowed to get. Before we get into it, if you are new here, welcome. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you've been here before, you already know. We don't rush things. We let them breathe. Now let's go. She had knocked on the gate at dusk, on a road called Yemassee in Beaufort County, South Carolina. A low fence, a hand-painted address marker on a wooden post, a white farmhouse set back among oaks, a barn to the south, and beside the barn, a fenced pen where goats moved in the fading evening light. A light was on in the house. She had been walking for most of 2 days. Her shoes had rubbed the skin open behind both heels somewhere around noon. She had stopped checking her phone because every direction looked like more road. At a gas station that morning, she had counted the coins in her jacket pocket for a bottle of water, come up short, and put it back. The cashier had seen. The man behind her in line had seen. Nobody said a word. That was worse than if they had. When a truck slowed behind her on the highway that afternoon, she stepped into the ditch before she realized she had moved. She had $190, a phone at 40% battery, and no charger. She knocked on the gate post. A man came out onto the porch. Tall, broad through the shoulders, white hair cut close, with the movements of someone who had spent decades not wasting motion. He came across the yard and stood on the other side of the gate and looked at her without speaking first, taking in the full picture before deciding anything. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "I've been walking since this morning. I'm not asking to come inside. If I could just rest in your pen, with the goats, just for the night. I'll be gone before sunrise." He looked at her for a long moment. She had the sense that he was not deciding whether to help her. He was deciding how. Then he unlatched the gate. "You're not sleeping in the goat pen." Low, unhurried. "Come inside." She tried again. "I don't want to." "You're already here," he said. "Come inside." She followed him across the yard and up the porch steps. The inside of the house was plain and clean. Nothing on the walls that didn't need to be there, a row of boots by the door, a lamp on in the front room. He moved through it without ceremony, familiar with every step. He heated food on the stove, leftover rice and stewed chicken, set a plate in front of her at the counter, poured 2 glasses of water, and pulled a stool across from her while she ate. He did all of it without commentary. No questions. No performance of hospitality. He simply fed her. She ate everything on the plate. She could not remember the last time she had done that. He showed her to a spare room at the end of the upstairs hall. A bed, a dresser, a window that faced the south field. "Bathroom across the hall," he said. "Spare toothbrush in the cabinet." He started to close the door. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. "Get some sleep." She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor. Her heels were raw where the shoes had been. She set her bag against the wall and lay down with her clothes on and looked at the ceiling. Outside, the goats made small sounds in the pen. The fields were dark and full of crickets. She had asked to sleep with the goats. She was asleep before the thought finished. 3 weeks earlier, Selah Fain still had a badge, a desk, a salary, and a life she had spent 6 years building. She was a hospital administrator at Broadfield Regional Medical Center in Columbia, procurement and supply chain. She had trained first as a licensed practical nurse, 3 years at a community health clinic in Greenville, before a supervisor pushed her toward administration and she found she was good at it. 6 years in the field. The last 3 at Broadfield. She was, it turned out, too good at it. It started with a number that didn't sit right. She was reviewing invoices from a vendor called Patent MedSource. 9 years at Broadfield. Cardiac monitors, surgical supply kits, consumables. The relationship predated Selah. Nobody had ever looked closely. Selah looked closely. 42 portable cardiac monitors billed. 27 received. No delivery confirmation on the remaining 15. No signature, no stamp, no warehouse entry. She pulled the previous quarter. Same gap. The quarter before that. The same. She went back 4 years. The difference between what Patent MedSource billed and what Broadfield actually received ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars. When she factored in that Medicare-covered patient billing was involved, what Broadfield had wasn't just a vendor problem. It was federal fraud, taxpayer money, and someone had been pocketing the difference for years. She sat with it for 2 days, checked her work 3 times. Then she called Trudy. Trudy Baines had been at Broadfield longer than Selah. They carpooled for 3 years. On a February evening 2 winters back, Trudy had talked for 40 minutes about a problem with her landlord, and Selah had listened to all of it without checking her phone. On a different night, Selah had cried in that same car over something she couldn't name, and Trudy had pulled over and said nothing, which was exactly right. Certain friendships become load-bearing before you realize it. You only notice when they are gone. Selah laid it all out. The invoices, the delivery logs, the gap. She spread the printed copies across the break room table between them. Trudy listened without interrupting. When Selah finished, she looked at the papers on the table between them and then back up. You have to report it, Trudy said. It's the right thing to do. Selah filed the formal report 3 days later. The board opened a review, then closed it. 9 days. No findings. The memo said the discrepancies were a documentation error in the receiving department, corrected now. Thank you for your concern. Selah filed a second report, more detailed. Every invoice, every gap, for years of it. 2 weeks later, she sat across from Kent Dross, the board chair. He greeted people with a handshake while his eyes were already past your shoulder, dismissed before the grip was done. He told her the review had been thorough. He told her her concerns had been noted and appreciated. Then he told her that her position was being eliminated as part of a restructuring, effective immediately. 40 minutes to clear her desk. Her access card was deactivated while she was still in the building. She spent 3 months and most of her savings on a legal fight that everyone agreed she should win. Her attorney took the case, took the money, and stopped returning calls. By the time she found out he had dissolved his practice and left the state, the filing window for key claims had closed. Every hospital position she applied for ended the same way. Interviews that went nowhere and references that she later found out had received undocumented, off-the-record cautions from people at Broadfield. Her relationship ended in the 8th month, without a scene. Money runs out, and horizons keep moving backward, and eventually people stop pretending otherwise. Then a cousin's house in Orangeburg. 2 weeks. Then that door closed too. A bag. $190. 40% battery. No charger. She started walking south. She did not know yet that she was carrying a name, one company name, that was about to change everything for a stranger she had never met. She woke before dawn and went to the barn. He was already there, feeding the herd, moving through the pen with the ease of 10,000 mornings behind him. She asked if she could help. He handed her a feed bucket. They worked side by side for an hour without much talk. That had its own kind of ease. 2 people in the early morning before the day had asked anything of either of them. He never told her what to do. He made room and let her figure it out, which was more useful than most people managed. She asked if she could stay 1 more day. She would work for it. He said yes without making a thing of it. She repaired a section of fencing along the south field that had been pulling loose from the post. Found the tools in the barn, the wire and staple gun on the same shelf. Grove came by in the afternoon, looked at the work, said nothing about it. She understood that to mean it was done right. At dinner they sat on the porch steps. He brought 2 plates out and set them on the wide top step facing the field, and she talked. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because the silence had become comfortable enough to fill. Maybe because she was tired of carrying it. She told him about Broadfield, the invoices and the delivery logs, the 2 reports and the 9-day review and the memo that said nothing, the board chair, the 40 minutes to clear her desk, the attorney who disappeared, the months of silence from every hospital after that. He listened without interrupting. He didn't shape his face into concern. He simply received what she said and held it and waited until she was done. That was rare, genuinely rare. When she finished, he asked one question. The vendor company. What was it called? Patent MedSource, she said. Out of Colombia. Grove's plate stopped halfway to the step. He looked out at the field, then back at her. Say that again. She did. He set the plate down on the step beside him. My last name is Patton, he said. She forgot to breathe. My brother started that company 11 years ago, he said. I gave the blessing at the ribbon cutting. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The goats moved in the pen. Somewhere in the field something made a sound and then stopped. You don't have to do anything, she said. It's your family. Grove looked at her. You came here asking to sleep in my goat pen, he said. You asked for less than you deserved, because the world had taught you that was the safe amount to ask for. He held her gaze. My brother is the reason for that lesson. He let that land. Tell me which one of us I'm supposed to protect. Selah had no answer for that. She wasn't sure one existed. That night, she got as far as pulling her bag off the floor before she stopped. 8 months had taught her something specific. When powerful families were involved, people who had nothing were safer when they disappeared first. She had learned that from the attorney, from the board, from the references that followed her out the door. The pattern was consistent. Move on before they make you. She stood there in the spare room with the bag in her hand and looked at the window that faced the south field. Then she set the bag back against the wall and lay down. She wasn't sure why. She just did. At 6 the next morning, Grove called his brother. He stood in the living room with the phone to his ear. He had not slept. He had lain awake and turned the name over, Patent MedSource, and thought about the ribbon cutting, the blessing he had given, the wide smile Burl had from the podium. He had spent years being proud of Burl, had used him, without pointing, as evidence from the pulpit that goodness could be built and sustained in a person over a lifetime. He lay there trying to find the exact place where building something real and performing the appearance of something real had separated in his brother. He could not find it. He was not sure they had ever been the same thing to begin with. He called at 6. Burl picked up. Grove used the company name, used the number she had given him, asked his brother directly whether any of it was true. A silence. Then Burl said it wasn't true. A documentation issue. Nothing more. That's all it had ever been. The woman had a grievance and was looking for a target. She doesn't know who you are, Grove said. She doesn't know you're my brother. Then what are you doing? Burl asked. And for just a moment, underneath the smooth delivery, there was something else, something tighter and more careful. I'm asking you to tell me the truth. Burl said that business had its realities, that billing arrangements between hospitals and vendors had always operated with some flexibility, that nobody had been hurt, that she had been creating problems for a lot of people with a great deal invested in a long working relationship. Burl, Grove said, I'm telling you. I heard what you said. Grove paused. I'm asking you if it's true. A long silence. I'm going to need you to leave this alone, Burl said finally. The warmth had dropped out of his voice, not to cruelty, but to something flat and certain. He had simply decided the conversation was already over. I am asking you, as your brother, to leave this alone. Grove looked at the window. He looked at the barn. He looked at the corner of the south field where the fence had been repaired. I'll talk to you later, Burl, he said, and hung up. He stood at the window until he heard Selah on the stairs. Then he turned around and told her everything. When he finished, she looked at the floor for a moment. You don't have to do anything, she said. It's your family. Grove looked at her for a long moment. He said nothing. He picked up his keys. 3 days later, Burl Patton drove to Mount Calvary Baptist Church, one of the oldest black congregations in Beaufort County, founded 1887. He sat with 3 senior deacons, men he had known for 30 and 40 years. He was unhurried. He was warm. He was Burl. He told them his brother had a stranger living at the farm, a woman in trouble who had come with a grievance against a business Burl barely had involvement with anymore. He said Grove had never fully gotten past a disagreement over their mother's estate years ago. He shook his head slightly. He said he was worried. His voice carried just enough weight to suggest real concern and not enough to suggest guilt. He had been performing that balance for 61 years, and it had never once failed him. Two of the three deacons listened with open faces. The third one, a man named Aldous Cruz who had known Grove Patton for 42 years, kept his eyes on the table and said nothing the entire time. Burl shook their hands on the way out, asked after one deacon's grandchildren by name, mentioned he would be sending a check to the building fund at month's end. Same as always. Then he drove home. That evening, a woman from the congregation called Grove. She had been in the building when Burl arrived. She thought he should know. Grove sat on the front porch in the dark for a long time. He understood what Burl had done. He understood what it meant. Burl had not come to the church to defend himself. He had come to bury her twice, once at Broadfield and once here, in the only place where Grove's name still carried weight. He had come to make sure that if Grove stood up to speak, the room would already be divided before his first word landed. That was who his brother was. Grove had known him for 61 years, and somehow had not known that until this week. Grove went back inside. He went to the church, Grove told Selah. She looked at him. He told them this was a family dispute. That you're using me. He paused. Then he asked after the deacon's grandchildren by name on his way out the door. Selah started to say something. He weaponized 40 years of goodwill in one afternoon, Grove said. That's who he has always been. I just didn't have reason to see it until now. He picked up the phone and called Pearl Haynes, a woman who ran the morning program on the county's small community radio station and whose voice reached 4 townships every weekday morning. You called Pearl when you needed a community to hear something, before the people trying to suppress it had a chance to react. Pearl had one question for him. Are you sure, Grove? She asked. Yes, he said. Then I'll put the word out that you're speaking Sunday morning. Mount Calvary. I'll let people know it matters that they come. She did. By Saturday evening, word had moved through the county. Church phone trees, barbershop conversations, front porch visits that lasted past dark. By Sunday morning, the pews at Mount Calvary were fuller than they had been in months, including one person who had not expected to hear his name in any of it. Burl's truck came up the driveway that same Saturday night. Grove went out and closed the door behind him. Burl came to the foot of the porch steps. Pressed shirt, good shoes. He looked up at Grove, his face arranged into something that was trying to look like sadness. Grove knew his brother's face. That wasn't sadness. That was the most dangerous thing Burl owned. I need you to stop, he said. Grove said nothing. This woman is using you. She came with nothing, and now she's turning you against everything you built your whole life around. He paused. Be careful, Grove. People trust me because I have spent 40 years earning it. Be careful what you make them choose. Grove. Something in the word, not a plea, not a threat. Something between the two that was harder to name than either. Mama would not have wanted this. The air between them flattened. You should leave now, Grove said. Something passed through Burl's expression. Calculation first, then something heavier. He turned and walked to the truck. Got in. The truck sat for a moment with the engine idling. Then the headlights swung and disappeared down the road. Grove stood on the porch until he could no longer hear the engine. Then he went back inside. His hand on the door handle was trembling slightly. He noticed it and let it. Grove Patton stood before the congregation of Mount Calvary Baptist Church on a Sunday morning for the first time in 6 years. He was not at the pulpit. He stood at the front of the sanctuary, same level as the pews, and waited for the room to find its attention. The 2 deacons Burl had spoken to were in their seats. Aldous Cruz, the third one, sat 3 rows back from his usual spot with his hands folded in his lap. Grove did not preach. He stated what he knew. His brother's company name. The contract with Broadfield Regional Medical Center. Billing for medical equipment that was never delivered. Equipment tied to patients' care and to government health care money, which made this not just a hospital scandal, but a federal matter. The administrator who had filed a formal report and been fired for it. The name of the woman who had been driven to his gate asking to sleep in a goat pen because the truth had taken everything from her. The room was not one thing. Some people nodded. Some looked at the floor. An older woman in the 4th row pressed her hand flat against her chest. One of the 2 deacons Burl had spoken to stared at the windowsill from the moment Grove said the company name and did not shift his eyes once. When Grove finished, he stood for a moment. I am not asking you to take my word for anything, he said. I am asking you to pay attention to what comes next. The truth doesn't need our help to land. It just needs room. He walked down the center aisle. At the door, a woman he had known for 30 years stepped back slightly as he passed. It was a small movement, barely anything. He felt it all the same. Outside, he stood alone in the parking lot for a while. The congregation filed past him in ones and twos. Some spoke, some didn't. A deacon named Marcus Pryor walked to his car without looking in Grove's direction, which Grove noted, because Marcus Pryor had never once passed him without speaking in 31 years. He stood in the parking lot and understood what had just been paid. Then he got in his truck. In the back of the parking lot, a young woman named Cressida, a community health outreach worker who had been trying to get a Columbia journalist to cover rural hospital billing for months, pulled out her phone and sent a text. The journalist's name was Penn Wall. Penn Wall had worked the healthcare beat at the Columbia Dispatch for 8 years. She had been on the Broadfield story for 9 months. She had documents, internal memos, source numbers. She had everything except one person willing to put their name to it publicly. She drove down that afternoon. She sat with Grove on the porch steps, and he answered every question. He named his brother, named the company, quoted the phone call, described what Burl had said to the deacons and when. Then Grove called Selah out and Penn spoke to her too. Penn published the following morning, before Burl had retained crisis counsel, before Kendros had coordinated a board response, before anyone with something to lose had a single word prepared. The article named Patton MedSource, named Burl, quoted Grove by name, former pastor of Mount Calvary Baptist Church, a man who had stood before his own congregation and said what he knew. It named Selah Fain correctly in print, for the first time anywhere, the administrator who had filed the original fraud report and been terminated in retaliation for it. By noon, the story had been picked up by 2 regional outlets and a national healthcare publication. By evening, the state health authority had opened a formal investigation. Within the week, federal investigators were at the door because the Medicare billing angle made this federal fraud, and federal fraud carried consequences that no private settlement could contain. 6 weeks into the federal investigation, phone records surfaced. A call placed 3 days before Selah filed her formal report, traced to a Columbia address. The recipient was the regional manager of Patton MedSource. The number belonged to Trudy Baines. Penn called Selah before publishing. Selah was standing in the south field when the call came in. She listened. When Penn finished, Selah drew a breath. "Thank you for telling me first," she said. She put the phone in her pocket. She stood in the field for a while. Then she went upstairs to the spare room. She sat on the bed. She opened her old messages with Trudy. She scrolled back to the week before she filed the report. The last message was still there. "Proud of you. Do the right thing." She read it once, then twice, then a third time. Then she put the phone face down on the bed and sat there and did not move for a long time. She did not cry when they fired her. She did not cry when the attorney disappeared. She did not cry when she counted coins for a bottle of water at a gas station and came up short and put it back. She did not cry when she asked a stranger if she could sleep in his goat pen. But sitting on that bed with Trudy's words still on her screen, something finally gave way. She put her face in her hands and she let it. Grove did not come up. He heard her from downstairs, and he stayed where he was, because he understood that some things have to be sat with alone first, before anyone else is allowed in. When she came back downstairs an hour later, he made coffee and set a cup on the side table and said nothing about what he had heard. That was the right thing. The worst part, she told him later that evening on the front steps, was not that Trudy had betrayed her. The worst part was that she still remembered the good parts. Grove looked at the field. "That means the friendship was real," he said. "What she did was also real." He paused. "Both of those things are going to be true for a long time. And that is just something you carry." Selah nodded. They sat with that. What followed came in pieces, the way real consequences always come. No drama, just accumulating weight. Burl Patton's company was seized by federal receivers. Criminal fraud charges were filed publicly. The Youth Basketball League removed his name from the Fellowship Hall banner on a Tuesday morning and issued no statement about it, which in some ways landed harder than an announcement would have. His pew at Mount Calvary sat empty Sunday after Sunday. The congregation that had celebrated him for 2 decades sat with something they hadn't asked for. The knowledge that they had been part of the landscape that kept him untouchable, that their respect had been borrowed and spent on his behalf, without their knowing for years. Aldous Cruz, the deacon who had kept his eyes on the table when Burl came to plant his story, called Grove 2 days after the article ran. "I should have said something that day," Aldous told him. "I knew something was wrong." Grove told him that knowing and acting were 2 different problems, and that at least he knew the difference now. Aldous didn't answer right away. Then he said thank you, and they hung up. These conversations didn't make the newspaper. They happened in phone calls and in front seats of cars parked outside churches at dusk. They were the real reckoning, not the federal charges, but the smaller accounting that every person who had been shaped by Burl's reputation had to do, privately, alone, with no audience. Kent Dross resigned from the Broadfield board before the federal findings went public. It did not help him. The investigation uncovered a financial arrangement between Dross and Patent MedSource going back 7 years, vendor consulting fees, undisclosed, a direct conflict that had sat beneath 9 years of unquestioned contracts. He faced personal civil liability. His photograph with the governor came down from the office wall. Broadfield Regional Medical Center issued a formal written statement. Selah Fain's original report had been accurate. Her termination had been wrongful. The institution had failed in its obligation to protect a whistleblower. On record, signed, permanent. Under federal whistleblower law, a person who originally reports fraud involving government healthcare billing is entitled to a percentage of all recovered funds. Selah had been the reporting party of record. The fraud had run for years. The sum was significant. A check arrived in the mail. She had not asked for it. She had not known it was coming. It was simply the law doing what it was designed to do when someone tells the truth, and the truth is eventually believed, returning to that person what the truth had cost them. She sat on the porch steps and held the envelope before she opened it. The goats moved in the south field. The fence held. She had fixed it with her own hands. Grove made one phone call to a woman named Greta Foss, director of Beaufort County Rural Health Services. He had walked beside her through one of the hardest years of her life when he was still at the pulpit. She had mentioned twice, in passing, that she had been trying to fill a position to run the county's mobile health clinic. 14 months without the right person. He called and said Selah's name, her background, her credentials, the nursing training, the 6 years in healthcare, what she had been through, and what she was good at. Greta called 2 days later. The mobile clinic ran twice a week through 4 rural townships, families that had been driving 45 minutes each way for basic care, people who had been making that drive, or not making it and hoping for the best. Selah took the job. On a Thursday morning in November, she parked the clinic van on Yemassee Road before her first stop and sat with the engine off. She thought about a gate in the dark, about who she had been standing at that gate, asking for less than she deserved, because the world had taught her that asking for more would only confirm what it had already decided about her. About the 40 minutes in the parking structure with a box in her hands. About the gas station. About Trudy's message still sitting on her phone, which she had not deleted, because she had decided that the friendship and the betrayal could both be true and both be kept. She thought about Grove Patton, what he had given up, his brother, his easy retirement, the peace available to a man who had already paid his debts to the world and earned the right to ask nothing more of himself. He had paid all of that. He paid it because he knew the difference between what was easy and what was right, and knowing that difference, he understood he had no real choice at all. He had not given her money. He had not handed her a document. He had opened a gate and set a plate of food down without questions, and he had picked up a phone and called his brother, and then a church, and then a journalist, each call smaller from the outside, larger from the inside. She had asked to sleep with his goats. She turned the key. The van started. 17 patients. For townships. People who deserved someone to show up for them, the same way a man had once opened a gate for a stranger in the dark. At the farm, a few miles north, Grove was already in the field. The morning was cool. The herd moved through the grass. He had stood in the parking lot of that church and absorbed it, the look that had not come, the colleague who had not spoken, the 31 years of community position that had shifted under him while he stood there. He had counted it before he walked down the aisle. He had known what he was paying before he paid it. He walked back to his truck and drove home, and went to bed and got up and came back to the field. That was all. That was the whole of it. He stood in the field and looked at his land. He did not look like a man with regrets. He looked like a man who had found, late in the last chapter of his life, the thing that confirmed everything he had ever believed from the pulpit, that doing right was not its own reward, except that it was, entirely and had always been. And a woman who came to that gate asking for less than she deserved walked away, in time, with everything that actually mattered. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If this story moved you, share it with someone who has ever done the right thing and paid for it. And in the comments, tell me where you are watching from, but also answer this. Have you ever met a Grove Patton? Someone who helped you when it cost them something real? Subscribe to the Storytelling King. We will see you in the next one.